Welcome back. I was reviewing this particular script for several days before deciding it belonged here. Most betrayal stories hinge on emotion. The screaming, the confrontations, the tears. This one hinges on a man who drove through a Category 2 storm, saw exactly what he suspected, and did nothing that night. That restraint is the entire weapon. You're watching His Eternal Diary. I drove through a storm to reach her. She was already leaving with him. The smell hit him first. Petrichor, sharp and mineral cold, the way it always smelled when the weather system off the coast finally broke. Ethan Carr had driven 12 hours in rain that came down sideways, the kind of rain that found every seal in the doorframe, that made the wipers useless beyond 60 kilometers an hour, that turned the highway into a black mirror reflecting nothing useful. His shoulders ached from the posture. He'd stopped twice, once for gas, once for cheap coffee that tasted like it had been sitting in the carafe since morning, which it had. He'd known it when he bought it. He'd drunk it anyway, because the caffeine wasn't the point. The ritual was. The familiar grayness of a styrofoam cup, the way reality felt more anchored when small, ordinary things were still ordinary. He was 40 minutes outside the city when he noticed that he wasn't afraid. That was the thing that surprised him, not the storm, not the road, not what waited at the end of it. He should have been afraid. Any man driving this distance in this weather to reach a woman he suspected was already somewhere she shouldn't be would have felt something coiling in his chest. But Ethan Carr simply drove. He adjusted the defroster. He checked his mirrors. He merged when he needed to merge and kept his speed at exactly 82 kilometers per hour, which was, he had calculated years ago, the optimal speed for this stretch of highway in heavy rain. Fast enough to maintain control through the steering sensitivity, slow enough to react to standing water. He was 34 years old. He had dark hair that needed a cut, a jaw that looked like something carved rather than grown, and hands that had once, in another life, or perhaps more precisely, in this same life, but a different pass at it, gripped a steering wheel on a night exactly like this one, and driven headlong into a guardrail at 112 kilometers per hour. He did not do that this time. This time, Ethan Carr drove at 82 kilometers per hour and thought about asset protection clauses. Specifically, he thought about Section 12D of the marital property agreement he had filed 3 months ago under the name of a holding company his wife knew nothing about. He thought about the amended shareholder registry he'd had notarized in November, the one that reclassified 40% of his equity stake in Carr Meridian Holdings from marital property to premarital enterprise capital, a distinction that required, under state commercial code, only the signatures of 2 independent certified accountants and a filing in the corporate registry, none of which required Lydia's knowledge or consent. He thought about the trust arrangement he'd established for his sister's 2 children, into which he had systematically moved the most liquid portions of his personal assets over the preceding 18 months, structured as educational endowments, so that they were, functionally, untouchable under divorce proceedings. He thought about these things the way a chess player thinks about moves already made, with a quiet, neutral satisfaction. Not warmth, not triumph, just the recognition that the board was set. The city lights appeared on the horizon like a smear of amber through the rain-fogged windshield. Ethan turned down the radio. He'd been listening to nothing for the past 2 hours, just the white noise of rain on glass and the low percussion of the wipers. In his previous life, he would have called her by now. He would have called 3 times, gotten voicemail, called her best friend, gotten voicemail, and then driven the last 40 minutes with his hands tight enough on the wheel that his knuckles would have gone white. He would have arrived at the Alderton Grand Hotel, where the Meridian Group's annual partner dinner was being held, half-soaked, slightly panicked, and completely unprepared for what he would find. In his previous life, that version of him had walked through the lobby of the Alderton Grand and seen his wife of 4 years standing at the entrance with Daniel Hale, Ethan's oldest friend and majority business partner. And the image had hit him the way physical blows are supposed to hit. Not with pain first, but with a kind of stunning wrongness, the body's refusal to process information that the mind has already decoded. He'd stood there, rain dripping from his coat, and watched Daniel hold the car door open for Lydia with a hand placed in the exact spot on her lower back that said everything. He'd watched her look up at Daniel with an expression she had stopped aiming at Ethan sometime around their 3rd anniversary. He'd watched them slide into a black car together and disappear into the same rain he'd just driven through. And he'd stood on the steps of the Alderton Grand and known, with the certainty of a man who has just seen a mathematical proof complete itself, that he had lost everything. 6 months later, the divorce proceedings had been a public, protracted disaster. Daniel Hale, it emerged, had been maneuvering inside Car Meridian Holdings for 18 months. He'd used Lydia, or she had used the opportunity of Daniel, it was difficult in the end to determine the sequence, to extract information about Ethan's personal financial positions, his assets, his contractual vulnerabilities. The divorce had stripped Ethan of his primary residence, 51% of his business equity, and his liquidity, because the marital property laws of this state were, in the words of his first life's attorney, not particularly sympathetic to high-income individuals who failed to establish protective documentation prior to marriage. He'd been 42 days from signing the final transfer documents when his car had gone through the guardrail. The coroner's report had called it an accident. Ethan Carr had never been entirely certain it was. And then he had woken up, age 31, in the bed of the apartment he'd shared with Lydia in the early years, and she had been lying beside him reading a novel with a green spine, and the bedside clock had read 7:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, and outside the window the city had been going about its business in the pale blue morning light, entirely unaware that the man lying in the bed had just experienced 3 years of catastrophic loss and the end of his own life. He had not panicked. He had looked at the ceiling for a long time. He had catalogued the information. He had begun, in the quiet of the earliest morning, to plan. Now, 3 years later, or rather 3 years into this second pass, he took the exit for the Alderton Grand district and felt the familiar low hum in his chest that wasn't quite anticipation and wasn't quite calm. It was the state he had come to think of as operational, the state in which emotion became data and data became leverage. The hotel's covered drive was a relief from the rain. He pulled in behind a line of cars and sat for a moment, engine idling. Through the tall glass front of the Alderton Grand, he could see the partner dinner still in progress. Movement, the dark shapes of suited people against a warm interior that from the outside looked like a painting. He checked the time, 10:47 p.m. The dinner was winding down. He had timed this. He knew, because he had known it 3 years ago, that Daniel and Lydia would be leaving together at approximately 10:55 p.m. They had been leaving together at 10:55 for 5 months. The pattern was documented. He had the documentation. Ethan stepped out of the car. He didn't pull his collar up against the rain because the covered drive protected him from it, and he had found over the past 3 years that unnecessary gestures, bracing against things that weren't there, tensing before impacts that wouldn't come, were a drain he couldn't afford. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the entrance. She came through the glass doors at 10:53. Lydia Carr was wearing a dress the color of dark copper, and she looked exactly the way she had always looked at events like this. Composed, slightly separate from everything around her, as though the social architecture of a hotel ballroom was a pleasant backdrop she had no real investment in. She was 32 years old. She had the particular kind of beauty that was more geometry than prettiness. Angular jaw, high cheekbones, eyes that were a very ordinary shade of brown, but that held the world at a consistent arm's length. Ethan had once been fascinated by the cool precision of her. He had mistaken it for depth. He had learned, the slow way, that it was simply distance. There was nothing profound behind it, just the comfortable absence of obligation. She didn't see him immediately. Daniel Hale came through the doors 4 steps behind her. He was taller than Ethan, broader, with the kind of face that photographed well, and a handshake that had closed more deals in the past decade than Ethan cared to count. He had a hand, that hand, settled at the base of Lydia's back before they'd cleared the doorway. His head was bent toward hers, and he was saying something that made her smile, a slight, private smile, the kind she reserved for things she didn't want to share. Ethan stood at the base of the steps. The rain made a sound like static against the edge of the covered drive. A valet 3 meters to his left pretended not to watch. It was Daniel who saw him first. The change in Daniel's face was instructive. Not guilt, not exactly, but the particular recalibration of a man who has been operating in the confidence of invisibility and has just registered a variable he didn't account for. His eyes went from Ethan's face to Ethan's car, still visible at the edge of the drive, still carrying 12 hours of storm grime on its body, and then back to Ethan's face. Lydia followed Daniel's gaze. "Ethan." Her voice had no inflection. Not surprise, not guilt. Just his name, deployed like a flag marking territory. "You look cold," Ethan said. He meant it literally. She'd come out without a coat. The dress was sleeveless. She was holding her small clutch against her ribs with the tight automatic grip of someone suppressing a shiver. "I didn't expect you until tomorrow." She hadn't moved toward him. "The conference ended early. I thought I'd drive back." He looked at Daniel. "Good dinner?" Daniel had the discipline, Ethan would give him that, to hold his face in a careful arrangement that communicated nothing except pleasant surprise. "Ethan, didn't know you were back. You should have told someone. We'd have held a seat." "I'm fine," Ethan said. "I ate on the road." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. Ethan counted them. In his previous life, those 4 seconds had been the moment when he'd said something. He could no longer remember exactly what. Something raw and fractured, something that had let them both see how badly he was bleeding. He'd given them that. He'd given them the satisfaction of knowing they'd broken through. This time, he smiled. It was a small, even smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and he directed it at both of them equally. "I'll meet you at home," he said to Lydia. "Whenever you're done." He turned and walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat for 40 seconds. He could see them through the rearview mirror, still standing at the top of the steps, still working out what had just happened. And then he pulled out of the drive with no particular urgency and merged into the rain-slicked street. He drove to the apartment. He made a cup of tea. He sat in the chair beside the window that looked out over the street and waited. Lydia came home 40 minutes later. She came in through the front door with the practiced quiet of someone who expects to find the lights off. She found them on. She found Ethan in the chair. She stood in the entrance corridor for a moment with her coat folded over one arm and her expression locked into its default neutral register. "You drove in the storm," she said. "I did. That was unnecessary." "Probably." He took a sip of the tea, which had gone slightly cool. "How was the dinner, aside from the speech?" Hargrove's speeches are always about 20 minutes longer than they need to be. There was a pause. She came further into the room, set her coat and clutch on the side table, and moved toward the kitchen with the efficient, slightly too casual movement of a person managing their own body language. The food was decent. The salmon was overcooked. It usually is. She poured herself a glass of water, drank half. He watched her back. "Ethan," she set the glass down. Why are you looking at me like that? Like what? Like you're waiting for something. He considered the question. He'd been asked that question in slightly different words, in some form or another, for the last 3 years. She'd always been perceptive about discomfort, less perceptive about the cause of it. "I'm not waiting for anything," he said. "I drove a long way in bad weather and I'm tired. I was glad you got home safe. That's all." She looked at him for a moment with those brown eyes that held their distance without effort, and he looked back at her with the same composed neutrality, and nothing passed between them, except the familiar absence. "You should get some sleep," she said, and went to the bedroom. Ethan sat in the chair for another half hour. He thought about the calls he needed to make in the morning. He thought about the documents his attorney had prepared for filing. He thought about the financial forensics report, 79 pages, annotated, cross-referenced with bank statements, corporate transaction logs, and wire transfer records, that was currently sitting in a sealed envelope in the offices of Marcus Kellner, CPA, whose firm had been auditing Car Meridian Holdings since its inception, and whose professional obligation required him to act on evidence of financial misconduct within 14 business days of receipt. Ethan had delivered that envelope 4 days ago. He finished the tea. He stood. He went to the bedroom, where Lydia was already asleep with the careful stillness of someone who is not quite asleep. He undressed. He got into bed on his side, which was the right side. The sheet had that particular cool, clean smell of fabric conditioner, and under it, faint but present, the ordinary smell of the room they had shared for 4 years. Not quite his smell, not quite hers, just the accumulated atmospheric presence of a marriage. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and felt nothing sharp. Only the operational hum. Only the orderly sequence of what was coming. Sleep arrived without negotiation. He was a patient man now. He had learned patience the hard way, which meant he had learned it through death, and there was no harder teacher than that. The thing about financial forensics, the thing that nobody outside the field properly understood, was that money left marks the way blood left marks. Not always visible to the naked eye, not always accessible through ordinary means, but always, always there, if you knew where to press and what chemical to apply. Every transaction had a signature. Every transfer had a trail. The human capacity for financial malfeasance was vast and creative, but it was not as vast as the paper record that accompanied it, and Ethan Carr had spent 11 years as a forensic financial analyst before founding Car Meridian, and he had spent those 11 years learning to read the language that money wrote on the walls of corporate structures. He had begun reading those walls 3 years ago, 3 years into this second chance, or 3 months after his rebirth, depending on how you counted, when he had started to recognize the pattern inside his own company. It had begun as intuition, the intuition of a man who had already watched it play out once, and was now watching the early stages from a position of foreknowledge. He had not known the exact mechanism the first time. He had known the results, not the method. The results, the first time, had been: Lydia had access to his personal financial records through joint accounts and shared passwords he'd never thought to protect. Daniel had access, through his majority partnership position, to the internal valuation models, the prospective acquisition targets, the liquidity schedules. Together, those 2 data streams had given them a complete picture of Car Meridian's financial architecture, its strengths, its pressure points, the specific sequence of events that would make a hostile reclassification of equity most advantageous. What Ethan hadn't known the first time was that Daniel had been siphoning money. Not directly, nothing so crude. What Daniel had been doing, what the forensic trail, once Ethan knew to look for it, revealed with devastating clarity, was a method called strategic vendor inflation. Over 18 months, Daniel had been routing Car Meridian's operational expenditures through a series of service vendor accounts that existed on paper but had no operational substance. 3 consulting firms and 1 technology infrastructure provider, all registered to shell entities in jurisdictions with limited disclosure requirements, all billing Car Meridian for services that were either substantially inflated or entirely fictional. All routing their receipts, ultimately, and through a sophisticated layer of subsidiary accounts, back to a private account held under a trust in Daniel's sister-in-law's name. The total, as of Ethan's most recent forensic reconciliation, was $4,280,000. This was not a marital dispute. This was wire fraud, tax evasion, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate theft. This was a criminal matter. The call to Marcus Kellner came at 8:47 the following morning, while Lydia was in the shower. Ethan sat in his home office with the door closed, his laptop open to the corporate registry filing he'd completed in November, and spoke to Kellner in the same low, even tone he used for all important calls. The tone that contained no urgency, and therefore contained it completely. "I've reviewed it," Kellner said. He had the voice of a man who had been giving people bad financial news for 30 years and had made peace with that as his professional identity. "My team spent the weekend going through the supplementary records. The pattern is unambiguous." "I know." A pause. "The question is how you want to proceed. This is my obligation to flag. 14 business days from receipt, as you know. But there's a process question about whether we file the regulatory notice first or whether you move through the civil mechanism simultaneously." "Simultaneously," Ethan said. Another pause. Longer. Kellner was a precise man who took precision seriously, and he was now precision measuring his next words. "The simultaneous path will escalate quickly once it begins. There will be exposure on the personal side, as well as the corporate side. Your wife—" "I'm aware of my wife's situation." "Ethan." Kellner's voice dropped half a register. "I've known you for 11 years. I'm asking, as your accountant, and as someone who's watched you build this company, is there any part of this you want to slow down, to give someone a chance to come forward?" Ethan thought about the covered drive of the Alderton Grand, the rain at the edges, the hand on the lower back. "No," he said. "Right," Kellner exhaled. "I'll have the regulatory filing prepared by end of week. I assume your attorney is ready on the civil side?" "She filed the preliminary documentation yesterday." A longer pause. "Yesterday, before you came home?" "Yes." "You drove back in a Category 2 storm to—" "It was Category 1 by the time I reached the coast. The models overstated the intensity." Ethan closed the laptop. "Thank you, Marcus. I'll wait for your confirmation." He put the phone down. Through the closed door, he could hear the shower had stopped. The faint sound of the bathroom cabinet opening and closing. The ordinary domestic sounds of a woman who did not know that the architecture of her carefully constructed future had been, in the preceding 14 hours, quietly and irreversibly detonated. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and thought about the version of himself who had stood in the rain at the top of those steps and fallen apart. He had pity for that man. He did not have contempt for him. You couldn't fault a person for breaking when the breaking came without warning. The tragedy of the first life had not been that Ethan had been weak. It had been that he had been unprepared. He was prepared now. The legal mechanism that Ethan had built over the past 36 months was not the kind of thing that happened in a single dramatic moment. That was the fundamental misunderstanding people had about sophisticated revenge. They imagined it as a confrontation, a revelation, a scene. They imagined raised voices and produced documents and the satisfying visual of a guilty person's face registering collapse. This was what novels and films had trained people to expect. What Ethan had built was nothing like that. What he had built was a systematic dismantling apparatus, and like all good apparatus, it ran on its own once set in motion. You didn't need to be present. You didn't need to be observed. You didn't, in fact, need to do anything theatrical at all. You simply needed to have placed the components correctly, in the correct sequence, sufficiently in advance, and then you needed to not be in the way when the mechanism ran. The first component was the equity reclassification, which was already filed and legally unassailable. Under State Commercial Code Section 14C, equity stakes in a privately held company could be designated as premarital enterprise capital if they met 3 criteria. They had existed prior to the marriage in substantially their current form. They had been maintained with funds traceable to premarital income, and they had been subjected to independent valuation within 60 days of reclassification filing. Ethan's original stake in what was then a 2-man operation, him and Daniel, before the Meridian merger, predated his marriage to Lydia by 4 years. The maintenance funds were traceable through 11 years of personal tax returns. The independent valuation had been conducted by a firm in which neither party had any financial interest. Filed in November, notarized, registered, done. This meant that in any divorce proceeding, 53% of Ethan's equity in Car Meridian Holdings was categorically unavailable for division. Not contested, unavailable. It wasn't a question the court would even entertain. The second component was the trust arrangement for his sister Petra's children, his nephew Callum, age 6, and his niece Maya, age 4. He had established educational trusts for both children 18 months ago, funding them at the rate of $40,000 annually from his personal income. This was, by any objective measure, a legitimate and generous family arrangement. The trusts had been established with full legal transparency, reported on his tax filings, and were administered by an independent trustee. The fact that they had also, in the preceding 18 months, absorbed the vast majority of Ethan's liquid personal assets, the savings, the investment portfolio, the cash accounts, in a perfectly legitimate educational gift structure was, from a legal standpoint, simply a matter of timing. Lydia's attorneys, when the divorce became public, would find that Ethan Carr's liquid personal net worth was substantially lower than they had anticipated. They would look at the trust arrangement, and they would calculate, correctly, that it had been established prior to any formal divorce action. They would be unable to argue fraudulent conveyance because the trusts had been running for 18 months and had not been established in anticipation of a specific legal proceeding. They would note it in their filings. The court would note it. And then the court would move on, because there was nothing improper to address. The third component was Daniel Hale. This was the component that required the most delicacy, and it was the one that Ethan had spent the most time on. The forensic report, the 79-page document he had spent 14 months preparing, cross-checking, and having independently verified by a consulting firm he'd retained under a non-disclosure agreement, was not a private document. It was a regulatory document. It had been delivered to Marcus Kellner in his capacity as the company's registered external auditor, which meant that Kellner was legally obligated to report its findings to the appropriate financial regulatory bodies. This was not Ethan's choice. This was the mechanism of financial oversight that Ethan had simply chosen to activate. Daniel Hale had stolen from the company. The documentation of that theft was now in the hands of an auditor legally required to report it. The outcome of that process was not within Ethan's control. He was merely a witness to it, a contributor of documentation. He had no personal vendetta. He had no agenda. He was, in the eyes of the regulatory framework, simply a corporate principal who had become aware of potential financial misconduct and had brought it to the attention of the appropriate accountant. What would happen to Daniel as a consequence? The regulatory investigation, the potential criminal referral, the civil suit that Car Meridian's board, who did not yet know what was coming, but who would have, under their fiduciary duty, no choice about how to respond, would initiate. Was the law working as designed? Ethan found this, as a concept, deeply satisfying. Not because it removed him from the equation, though it did, but because it meant that Daniel Hale's destruction would come wrapped in the absolute legitimacy of institutional process. He would not be able to frame it as personal. He would not be able to tell Lydia, or anyone else, that Ethan had come after him out of anger or jealousy or wounded pride. He could not dress it in the language of betrayed men doing petty things. The regulatory body didn't care about Lydia. The auditor didn't care about the Alderton Grand. The commercial law framework had no interest in Daniel's hand on anyone's back. It only cared about $4,280,000 in fraudulent vendor transactions, and on that matter, it was not sympathetic. 3 weeks passed. They were, superficially, ordinary weeks. Ethan went to the office. He attended the meetings on his calendar, which he had been thinning out for the past month, shifting his direct involvement in live projects to other members of his team, transitioning client relationships to partners whose positions were not about to become complicated. He had lunch with his sister Petra on a Tuesday, in the unremarkable Italian place near her office, and listened to her talk about Callum's swimming lessons and Maya's developing conviction that horses were, specifically, better than all other animals. He ate his pasta and watched his sister's face and felt something close to uncomplicated warmth, which was still available to him when the context was right. He came home each evening to the apartment. Lydia was there, or she wasn't. When she was, they maintained the civil, well-furnished performance that had been their marriage for the past year and a half. She cooked, or he cooked. They ate at the table or in the living room, depending on how much energy either of them had for the table. They talked about things at a comfortable remove. They were polite. When she wasn't there, he worked. He read the technical literature of his field. He slept without difficulty because there was nothing unresolved keeping him awake. Daniel, during those 3 weeks, acted normally. He came to the office with his usual competence and his usual ease. He was good in the meetings. He had always been good in meetings. It had been one of the things that had made him genuinely valuable, before Ethan had understood what else he was. He spoke to Ethan with the careful, practiced warmth of a man who knows he is being watched and has decided that brazen normalcy is the safest response. There was nothing in his behavior that acknowledged the covered drive, the storm, Ethan standing at the foot of the steps. Perhaps Daniel had decided that Ethan had seen nothing conclusive. Perhaps he had made a rational calculation that Ethan was not the type to act. He had known Ethan for 15 years, and had clearly, at some point in the past 3, revised his model of what Ethan was capable of to something smaller and more manageable. This was useful. Ethan had encouraged it. On the 22nd day after the storm, a Monday, Maskellner's office submitted the regulatory report to the Financial Standards Oversight Commission. Ethan was not present for this. He was in a client meeting across town, going over a real estate acquisition structure with a property developer who'd hired Car Meridian to manage the financial due diligence on a commercial portfolio. He was thorough. He was attentive. He answered 3 questions about depreciation schedules with the kind of precise, well-organized clarity that made clients feel their money was in competent hands. He shook the developer's hand at 3:15 p.m. and walked out into a cold, clear afternoon with no weather at all. His phone showed 4 missed calls from Daniel by the time he checked it, 2 from the company's general counsel, 1 from the board chairman, Henry Voss. He called Henry first. Ethan. Henry Voss was 71 years old and had been in corporate finance since before Ethan was born. His voice on the phone had the weight of a man who understood the gravity of what he was handling. I've just been briefed by our legal team on a report, a regulatory submission from Kellner's office. You need to know that the board is convening an emergency session this afternoon. Are you available? I'll be there at 4:30, Ethan said. Good. A pause. This is going to be ugly. Yes, Ethan said. It is. The emergency board session lasted 2 hours. Daniel was not present. He had been notified at 2:45 p.m. that the board session did not include his participation and that he should not attend the office pending a legal review. The message had been delivered by the general counsel in the kind of flat, corporate language that stripped humanity from everything it touched, and that was precisely what it was designed to do. Corporate language was a neutralizing mechanism. It turned people into problems to be administered. Ethan sat at the long table in the boardroom, at the left side, not the head, because the head was Henry's, and Ethan had always known where to sit, and listened as the general counsel walked the board through the 79 pages. He listened as 3 board members who had known Daniel Hale for a decade processed the information through the visible stages of institutional response: disbelief, then the internal calculation of liability, then the resigned hardening that was the precursor to action. He answered the questions directed at him with the same even, organized clarity he had used all day. He expressed no personal feeling about Daniel. He stuck to the document. He pointed to figures when figures were requested, walked through the forensic methodology when methodology was questioned, cited the independent verification when the board's counsel asked about second opinions. Afterward, in the corridor, Henry Voss pulled him aside. Henry was a compact man with white hair and the kind of stillness that accumulated over decades of managed crisis, and he looked at Ethan for a moment with the particular expression of a man trying to read something that will not be read. "How long have you known?" Henry said. "I became aware of the pattern approximately 14 months ago," Ethan said. "I spent 11 months building a documented case rigorous enough to withstand regulatory and legal scrutiny before presenting it to Kellner. I wanted to be certain." Henry was quiet for a moment. 14 months, and you said nothing until the documentation was complete. If I'd raised it earlier, without sufficient documentation, Daniel would have had time to move the money or obscure the trail. Or he would have contested the findings, and the process would have become about credibility rather than evidence. I needed the evidence to be complete before anyone could respond to it. Henry studied him. You knew, and you worked beside him for 14 months. He was competent at his job, separate from the fraud. Ethan straightened his jacket. The company's client relationships didn't suffer from the arrangement. Once the legal process is complete, I'll personally transition his client portfolio to ensure continuity. Another pause. Longer. Henry Voss had the look of a man who was revising something about the person he was looking at. You're a very controlled person, Ethan, Henry said. I was taught to be, Ethan said, which was not entirely true. He had taught himself to be, through the specific curriculum of dying badly and being given, by whatever mechanism the universe employed for such things, the chance to do it correctly. Henry nodded, once. The board will recommend criminal referral alongside the civil proceedings. We have no discretion in that, given the quantum. You should be prepared for the next several weeks to be demanding. I'm prepared. He went home. Lydia was there. She was sitting on the sofa with her shoes off and a glass of wine held in both hands, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that told him she already knew something. Not the full thing, not yet. The corporate news wouldn't be public until morning, but Daniel would have called her. Daniel, in the hours since 2:45, would have been managing his own situation, and managing Lydia's knowledge was part of that. Ethan, she said. Evening. He set his bag down. He went to the kitchen for a glass of water. She followed him to the doorway. "I heard that something happened at the office today." There was a board session. He drank the water, set the glass down, turned to look at her. Daniel is facing a regulatory investigation for financial misconduct within the company. Whatever she had heard from Daniel was evidently incomplete because her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not with the kind of emotional transparency that other people defaulted to, but with the minute recalibration that, in Lydia's face, stood in for feeling. Financial misconduct. Wire fraud is the most applicable statutory category. Also, breach of fiduciary duty and corporate theft. He said it evenly, not cruelly, just clearly. The auditor was legally required to report it once the documentation was submitted. The board had no choice but to act. The documentation was submitted by the company's retained forensic analyst, acting in coordination with the external auditor. He met her eyes. By me. Yes. The room was very quiet. The refrigerator made its low, indifferent hum. Lydia set her wine glass on the counter. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face. Not in this life, not in the previous one. He tried to categorize it. It was not fear, exactly. It was closer to the expression of someone who has been playing a game and has just understood that the other player was operating by a completely different set of rules. Rules the second player hadn't known existed. "How long?" she said. "How long have you been doing this?" 14 months of documentation. 3 years of preparation. He said this without particular emphasis. The equity reclassification was filed in November. The asset trust arrangement for Petra's children was established 18 months ago. The shareholder registry amendment was notarized in November as well. A long pause. "You knew." Her voice was careful. "Before tonight. Before the Alderton Grand." "Yes." "Then why—" She stopped, started again. "Why drive in the storm, if you already—" "Because I needed to see it." He considered this. He had thought about it, and he had the answer ready, and he delivered it in the same tone as everything else. Not to confirm it. I already knew. But there's a difference between knowing something and having looked at it directly. I needed to have done that before the mechanism was complete. She stared at him. He looked back. "The mechanism," she said. "The process," he amended. "Call it what you prefer." "Is this a divorce?" she said. "That will be separate from the legal proceedings against Daniel. Yes. My attorney filed the preliminary documentation the day before I drove back. By the time you retained counsel, the equity protection filing was already registered, and the asset structure was already in place." He was not cruel about this. He simply stated it in its proper sequence. "I'd recommend you find a good attorney. The process will be cleaner for both of us if you have strong representation." She was silent for a long time. She picked her wine glass back up. She looked at it, not at him. "You're not angry," she said. It was not entirely a question. "No." "You should be." He thought about the version of himself who had been, who had stood on the steps in the rain and felt the world crumple, who had spent 6 months after that discovery in a state of ragged, leaking grief, still going to the office, still performing competence, but not really there, functioning on the borrowed fuel of routine while the real self calcified somewhere internal. That version of himself had been very angry. It had not helped anything. It had only accelerated the process of his own destruction. "Anger is a resource," he said. "I used it for other things." She set the wine down again. She looked at the window. Outside, the city was doing what cities did, moving, illuminated, indifferent to the specific domesticity of this particular apartment. "Where will you sleep?" she said. "I've arranged a hotel for the rest of the month. I'll collect my things at the weekend." He picked up his bag. "The divorce proceedings will likely take 4 to 6 months, given the straightforwardness of the financial documentation. Your attorney will explain the parameters when you brief them." He went to the bedroom. He packed a bag with the efficiency of a man who has thought about exactly what he needs and exactly where he put it. He did not take anything that was hers. He did not take anything they had purchased together. He took his clothing, his laptop, the 2 technical manuals he kept on the nightstand, his grandfather's watch from the small lacquered tray on the dresser. He came back through the living room. Lydia was still at the window. "Ethan," she said. He stopped. "You planned everything." She wasn't asking. There was something in her voice that was different from anything he'd heard from her in 4 years of marriage. Something close to honest, close to the kind of recognition that stripped the performance away. "You planned all of it?" "Yes." "Did you ever—" She stopped. "Did any of it matter to you? Before you knew?" It was the most direct question she had ever asked him. He stood with his bag and thought about the early years, the apartment in spring when they'd first moved in, the way the afternoon light had come through the east window and laid itself across the floor in a specific shade of gold. The trip they'd taken to the coast in the 2nd year, before anything had begun to calcify between them, when she had been less armored and he had been less careful, and they had sat on a dock at sunset drinking beer from cans and not needing to perform anything for each other. The specific warmth of her weight on his shoulder on a train back from somewhere. "Yes," he said. "Some of it." She nodded, very slowly. She kept looking at the window. He left. The hotel was 12 floors up, with a view that on clear nights showed the harbor. Tonight was clear. The storm had scrubbed the atmosphere clean, the way storms did, leaving everything sharp and cold and very visible. He stood at the window for a long time after he checked in, his bag still unopened on the bed behind him, looking at the harbor lights on the water. He felt tired in the way that specific kinds of completion made you tired, not depleted, not hollow, just the tiredness of a long project finished, of a process that had run its full designed course. He had driven through the storm. He had stood on the steps. He had done nothing theatric. And then the mechanism had run. He called Petra. She picked up on the 2nd ring, and in the background he could hear the small domestic sounds of her house. Television, something clattering, Callum's voice asking something that she shushed. "You okay?" she said, the way sisters said it, which was really 5 other questions compressed into 2 words. "Yes," he said. "I'm at a hotel. Things are moving forward." A pause. "The divorce?" "And the other matter. Both." "Ethan." She was quiet for a moment. "I know you've had everything worked out. I know how you've been thinking about this. But are you actually okay?" He thought about the dock, the cans of beer, the specific shade of gold. "I think so," he said. "I think I will be." "You can come here if you need. Callum would be thrilled. He's been asking about you. Maya wants you to look at horses with her." "I'll come on Sunday," he said. "I'd like to see them." "Good." He could hear her nodding, the slight shift in her voice. "Sunday." He hung up. He stood at the window. The harbor lights reflected in small, bright columns on the water, each one distorted by the movement of the surface, each one its own imprecise version of the fixed light above. He thought about what Henry Voss had said. A very controlled person. It was accurate. But it was also, like most accurate observations about Ethan Carr, incomplete. Control was not the whole story. Control was the architecture. What lived inside the architecture was something else, something that he had not yet found the right word for and had stopped trying to name. An insistence on surviving correctly, on not giving the people who had arranged his destruction the additional gift of watching him be destroyed by the knowledge of it, on remaining, through the duration of whatever was required, in possession of himself. He had driven through the storm because the storm had been there and the destination had been at the end of it. That was all. He did not require the drama of impossible conditions to tell him something was worth doing. He had just calculated that the road was passable and the timing was right, and he had gone. He thought, briefly, about Daniel. Not with anger. With something closer to the feeling you got when you solved a problem that had presented itself as unsolvable. Daniel had been, in the purely technical sense, very good at what he'd done. The vendor inflation scheme had been sophisticated. It had required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to maintain a long performance. Ethan could acknowledge those qualities without the acknowledgement meaning anything warm. Daniel had also, in treating Ethan as an obstacle rather than a person, made the fundamental error of all people who underestimate the competence of the people closest to them. He had confused Ethan's quietness with passivity. He had confused Ethan's measured responses with limited capacity. He had looked at a man who never raised his voice and concluded that the man could be safely ignored. This was the mistake that Ethan found most instructive, in the way that mistakes made by capable people were always more instructive than the mistakes of incapable ones. Daniel was not stupid. He had simply operated on a model of Ethan that was constructed from a surface observation of Ethan's behavior and had never been tested against the underlying reality. He had observed correctly that Ethan did not perform. He had concluded, incorrectly, that this meant Ethan did not respond. Ethan always responded. He simply chose the timing and the form. Over the following 6 weeks, the investigation ran its course through the appropriate channels. The Financial Standards Oversight Commission's preliminary review confirmed the substance of the forensic report within 9 business days, a pace that indicated they had found the evidence both clear and urgent. The criminal referral to the Commercial Fraud Division of the State Attorney's Office was made on day 14. Daniel Hale was interviewed by investigators twice. His attorney, who was expensive and skilled, and not working with particularly strong material, attempted 3 separate procedural objections and had all 3 denied. The civil proceedings initiated by Carr Meridian Holdings, specifically the suit for recovery of misappropriated funds plus damages, were filed simultaneously, which created the legal condition of parallel tracks that meant Daniel had to manage both a criminal exposure and a civil liability with the same set of resources. Ethan testified in the civil preliminary hearings. He testified precisely, accurately, and without embellishment. He answered what was asked. He did not volunteer additional commentary. He did not look at Daniel across the courtroom with anything that could be read as personal. He was a source of documentation and expertise, not a victim performing injury. The distinction was important. Victims invited sympathy, but they also invited counter-narrative. The opportunity for the opposing side to reframe the story as a dispute between parties, to humanize the accused at the expense of the accuser's objectivity. Ethan gave them no such opportunity. He was not there as a wronged party. He was there as a witness to financial fact. Daniel's attorney did attempt, in the civil deposition, to introduce Ethan's personal relationship with Daniel as a motive for what the attorney chose to characterize as a targeted investigation. The implication was that Ethan had manufactured or selectively interpreted the evidence due to a personal grievance arising from circumstances unrelated to corporate matters. Ethan's attorney, a compact, precise woman named Julia Reeves, who had been operating in corporate litigation for 22 years, had anticipated this line. She objected on scope grounds. The objection was sustained. She had briefed Ethan extensively in advance. If the question came, he was to decline to address personal circumstances and redirect to the forensic methodology. He did exactly that. The attempted implication went nowhere. The documentation stood on its own. The divorce proceedings ran on the parallel personal track, as they were always going to. Lydia had retained a good attorney, one of the best in the city for high-asset marital dissolution, a man named Philip Crane, whose firm had successfully challenged several prenuptial structures in the past decade. Ethan had expected this, and had, through Julia Reeves's office, initiated the full disclosure of the November equity reclassification and the trust arrangements as the opening position, rather than waiting for Crane to discover them. This was a strategic choice. Disclosing first framed Ethan as transparent and cooperative, and removed Crane's ability to characterize the structures as evasive. They were not evasive. They were legal. But legal things could be characterized in many ways, and characterization was half the game in family court. Crane was, to his credit, professional. He reviewed the equity reclassification documentation for 2 weeks and came back with a single challenge: that the maintenance funds used to sustain the equity stake post-marriage had drawn on marital income in 2 specific fiscal years, which he argued constituted a partial commingling that entitled Lydia to a proportional claim on that portion of the equity. Julia Reeves reviewed the challenge and came back to Ethan with an honest assessment. The commingling argument has some merit on a narrow point. 2 fiscal years where about 8% of the maintenance draws came from joint accounts. He can make that case. What's the exposure? Ethan said. On that narrow portion, if the court agrees with his reading, you're looking at approximately 4 to 4.5% of the total equity value being potentially includable in marital property. Based on current company valuation, $600,000 to $700,000, give or take. Julia paused. The counterposition is that the maintenance was proportionally minimal and that the equity structure was substantively premarital. Most courts would accept that. But if you want to eliminate the risk entirely, we could negotiate a settlement on that specific point, a one-time payment at a discount to the claimed value. Ethan considered it. He thought about the cost-benefit in the way he thought about all cost-benefit questions, as a pure calculation, without the interference of pride or spite. Contesting the point would cost time, legal fees, and the residual uncertainty of a court decision. Settling it would cost money, but would close the variable. What's the minimum settlement number Crane is likely to accept on that specific point? I can open at $250, Julia said. Given the weakness in the overall claim, he'd probably settle at $350 to $400. $400,000. Settle it. Julia moved on it. Crane settled at $380,000. The settlement was structured as a lump sum payable from Ethan's personal account, not from the trust, not from the equity position, from cash. And it closed the commingling argument permanently. The rest of the divorce proceeded as Ethan had structured it. The equity reclassification held. The trust arrangements were noted in the proceedings and accepted as legitimate, prior-established financial commitments. The personal asset division addressed the apartment, the joint savings account, and several items of shared property, all of which Ethan had evaluated in advance and assigned reasonable values. He did not contest the apartment. He had not intended to live there regardless. He took his share of the joint savings, which was not substantial. He had, after all, been moving money into the educational trusts for 18 months, and he signed the final dissolution order on a Tuesday morning in late spring, in the offices of the family court, with Julia Reeves beside him, and an administrative clerk who had a small potted plant on her desk and looked as though she had witnessed 100 of these signings and would witness 100 more. He took the pen from the clerk. He signed his name in the appropriate box. He looked at his signature for a moment. Ethan Carr. 4 letters. 4 letters. His father's name, which meant nothing sentimental to him, because his father had been absent in the specific, unambiguous way that fathers who leave early are absent, but which was still his name, his, belonging to no one else in this room or any other room he had ever been in. He handed the pen back. Outside the courthouse, the morning was warm, the kind of warm that arrived in late spring before the summer settled in, not aggressive, not oppressive, just pleasant in the way of things that have no particular agenda. Julia walked beside him down the steps and said she'd send the final fee summary by end of week, and he thanked her, and she shook his hand with the firm, brief handshake of someone who is professionally satisfied with the outcome, but not personally invested in it. And that was exactly right. He walked 3 blocks to a coffee shop, not a chain, a small place with mismatched chairs and a handwritten menu on a chalkboard, and the smell of ground coffee and wood floors that had been cleaned with something lemon-based. He ordered a flat white and sat at a table near the window. The criminal proceedings against Daniel were at the preliminary hearing stage. The investigators had, in the preceding weeks, identified 2 additional vendor accounts beyond the original 4 that Ethan had documented, which had the effect of expanding the total to nearly $5 million and adding an additional tax evasion charge related to unreported income. Daniel had, through his attorney, entered a not guilty plea at the arraignment. The attorney had spoken publicly about context and mischaracterized internal accounting practices, which were the kinds of phrases that sounded like something in isolation and meant nothing when placed beside forensic documentation. Ethan sipped the coffee. It was good. It was not the styrofoam cup of the rest stop on the highway in the storm. It was nothing like that, and the contrast was not lost on him. He had been, that night, a man driving through bad weather toward something he had already decided to survive. He was now a man with a coffee in a warm room on a warm morning. 3 years of patient construction fully executed, sitting in the uncomplicated present tense of a life that was, structurally at least, clean. He thought about what came next. There was a property acquisition he'd been considering, a commercial portfolio in the Harbor District, the kind of thing that the dissolution of his partnership in Car Meridian would give him the bandwidth to pursue independently under a new structure. He had begun outlining it in a notebook 2 months ago, the kind of notebooks he kept for projects in early stages: graph paper, mechanical pencil, the pleasantly concrete resistance of good paper under a hard lead. He had not told anyone about this project. He had not needed to. He had become, over 3 years, very comfortable with the absence of the need to narrate himself to other people. In his first life, he had been the kind of man who talked about what he was going to do, with Daniel, with Lydia, with colleagues. He had mistaken the sharing of intentions for a form of intimacy. He had not understood, until the first life ended, that the sharing of intentions was also a form of vulnerability, and that vulnerability offered to people who had different agendas than you presented them with the precise blueprints of your exposure. He didn't share plans now. He executed them. The sharing came after, if at all. His phone showed a message from Petra. "Sunday still on? Maya has been telling the neighbors you're coming to look at horses." He typed back, "Sunday. Tell Maya I'm taking the horse question very seriously." He finished the coffee. He put the cup in the collection point near the door. He went out into the warm morning and started walking. Because there was no urgency, and the city was pleasant in this kind of light. And there was something he had learned, in 3 years of very deliberate living, about the value of moving through the world at its own pace when the circumstances allowed. He turned down toward the Harbor District. He wanted to walk the perimeter of the commercial portfolio he'd been considering. He had the property maps in the notebook, but there was a version of knowing a place that maps couldn't give you, a sensory calibration. the sound of the surrounding streets, the light quality in the morning versus the afternoon, the foot traffic at different hours, the way the adjacent buildings positioned their mass against the prevailing wind. He had learned to read those things. He had learned that they mattered. He walked for an hour and a half. He took notes, mechanical pencil, graph paper, with the focused attention of someone working a problem they enjoy. He stopped at one building and stood on the pavement opposite it for nearly 10 minutes, looking at the window placement on the upper floors, the loading access on the south side, the clear sightline to the water from what would, in his acquisition model, be the corner office on the 4th level. He was, as he stood there, approximately 300 meters from the Alderton Grand Hotel. He looked at the hotel for a moment, the covered drive, the glass front, the steps. He looked at it the way you looked at a photograph of something that had happened in the past, with the capacity for clear seeing that distance provided. The storm had been real. The rain had been cold and specific and had smelled of the ocean and of churned road surface. Lydia had been wearing copper and not shivering because she was too controlled to shiver. Daniel had placed his hand. The car had come. The lights had gone. None of it had happened in the sequence that it looked like from the outside. The storm, the arrival, the discovery, all of that was the surface layer, the visible story. The actual story had been running for 3 years before that night, in silence, in legal filings and forensic reconciliations and trust deeds and shareholder registry amendments and a notebook filled with graph paper and mechanical pencil marks. The storm had just been the weather. He turned back toward the harbor district and continued his walk. Daniel Hale pleaded guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of misappropriation of corporate funds at a hearing on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 weeks after the regulatory filing. The civil judgment in favor of Car Meridian Holdings, a judgment that included the full quantum of the misappropriated funds plus statutory interest and a penalty component that Julia Reeves had argued for and obtained, was entered simultaneously, as Ethan had arranged by filing the civil proceedings on a coordinated timeline. The total judgment, $5,400,000 plus costs. Daniel's personal assets, the house, the investment accounts, the equity position in the company that the board had moved to reclassify as forfeited upon criminal conviction, would cover a portion of it. The gap would be the subject of a long and uncomfortable conversation between Daniel, his attorneys, and a court-appointed financial administrator. None of this was Ethan's problem to manage. He was not in court for the guilty plea. He was in the Harbor District, in a meeting with a commercial property attorney named Rios, going through the structural terms of the acquisition. He had his notebook. The attorney had coffee from a machine in the corner that made a sound when it heated, that was exactly like the sound the refrigerator in the apartment he'd shared with Lydia used to make. That low, indifferent hum of a mechanical thing doing what mechanical things did, unaware of everything around it. He noted the sound without sentiment. "The holding structure you're proposing is clean," Rios was saying, flipping through the document Ethan had prepared. "I'd suggest one additional layer on the liability containment side, another subsidiary between the parent and the operating entity, but the fundamental architecture is solid." "Agreed on the additional layer," Ethan said. "I'll revise the diagram and send it over this week." "And the financing side?" "I have the funding. Personal capital, no institutional debt at this stage. I'll bring in a banking partner for the Phase 2 development, but the acquisition itself is clean." Rios looked up. He was a straightforward man, mid-50s, no visible interest in being impressed by things, which Ethan found refreshing. "You've thought this through?" "For a while," Ethan said. Rios nodded, returned to the document. They worked through the remaining points with the systematic thoroughness of 2 people who respected precision. Ethan's notes accumulated on the graph paper in the organized shorthand he'd developed over years. The meeting ran 90 minutes. At the end, they shook hands, and Rios said he'd have the revised structural proposal back within 5 business days. and Ethan said that was fine. He walked out of the building into the afternoon. He stood on the pavement and looked at the harbor. The water was flat today, without the animation that a good wind gave it. It simply lay there, reflecting a sky of no particular drama, being itself without comment. He thought about patience. Not the grinding, suppressive patience of waiting for things you had no power over, but the different kind, the productive patience of a man who has designed a machine and is watching the machine run. He had spent 3 years in that second mode, and it had asked nothing of him that he hadn't been prepared to give. Not his anger, not his grief, not his dignity. Just his time and his intelligence, directed with precision at the architecture of a situation that had, in its first iteration, taken everything from him. He was 34 years old. He had a new structure taking shape in a harbor district notebook. He had a nephew who was learning to swim and a niece who had strong opinions about horses. He had an apartment 12 floors up with a view of the water on clear nights. And he had the specific kind of quiet that came not from emptiness, but from resolution. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered it. "Mr. Carr?" The voice was professional, female, accented with the measured cadence of someone who made calls like this regularly. "My name is Claire Nguyen. I'm the acquisitions director at Voss Capital. We've been reviewing your profile in connection with the Harbor District commercial portfolio. It seems you may be looking at the same asset group we've been evaluating." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the water. "That's possible," he said. "We're not interested in competing on the same asset," she said. "We're interested in whether there's a co-acquisition structure that makes sense. The portfolio has some components that would benefit from your operational expertise, and some components where our institutional scale would accelerate the development timeline." "Who gave you my name in connection with that portfolio?" he said. A brief pause. "Marcus Kellner's office. He indicated you had a long-standing relationship with the firm and that you'd recently freed up capacity." Ethan almost smiled. Kellner, operating as he always did at the edge of his professional boundaries, threading the needle between discretion and helpfulness with the practiced ease of 30 years in the trade. "I'm open to a conversation," Ethan said. "Send me the structural outline you have in mind, and I'll review it." "Of course. Would next week work for an initial meeting?" "Thursday afternoon, 2 o'clock. "Perfect." Another professional pause. "Mr. Carr, I should mention I'm familiar with the Carr Meridian forensic situation. It's been public for several weeks now. I want to be direct that Voss Capital's interest here has nothing to do with that, and everything to do with what I've reviewed of your own work and your track record prior to the complications." "I appreciate the directness," he said. "It's the only way I know how to do business," she said. "Thursday then, 2 o'clock. He hung up. He stood on the pavement for a moment longer. The harbor was still doing nothing in particular with the flat light. A gull crossed the lower part of his vision, going somewhere with the purposeful indifference of things that flew. He put the phone in his pocket. He opened the notebook. He wrote, in the section he had labeled with a small letter V for Ventures, the words Voss Capital, Thursday, Harbor District Structure, COAC Possibility. And then he wrote 3 questions to investigate before Thursday, because he never went into a meeting without 3 prepared questions and the research to contextualize the answers. He closed the notebook. He began walking back toward the hotel. The afternoon was warm, but moving toward cool at its edges, the way late afternoons did in this season. The harbor district smelled of salt water, and faintly, of the coffee roastery on the corner of the block he was passing, which was a smell he had always liked. Not because coffee was sentimental to him, but because it was one of those smells that was straightforwardly good, that asked nothing of you except to notice it. He noticed it. He turned his collar up slightly against the edge cool of the afternoon. He walked at his own pace, which was measured and direct, the pace of a man who knows where he's going and is not in a particular hurry to perform the knowing. On Sunday, he drove to Petra's house in the early morning, before the city had fully committed to being awake. The roads were clear. The weather was nothing. No drama, no weather event, just a Sunday morning in late spring with the sky doing the pale, gradual brightening that preceded actual daylight. He drove at a reasonable speed on roads he knew. He listened to a radio program about urban waterway management, which was relevant to the Harbor District project and which he would not have found interesting 3 years ago, but which he now found structurally fascinating. The way water moved through a designed system, the balance between flow and containment, the engineering of what looked like effortless passage, but was in fact the product of extremely precise structural planning. Maya met him at the door. She was 4 years old and had Petra's coloring and a specific intensity of focus that, in adults, would have been called seriousness, but in children of 4 was just the pure expression of caring very much about one thing. Today, the one thing was horses. She had prepared, Ethan discovered in the first 3 minutes, a series of drawings that she wanted to walk him through. The drawings were detailed in the way 4-year-old drawings were detailed, expressive, confident, bearing no particular relationship to the proportions of actual horses, but completely certain of their own vision. He sat on the floor of the living room and looked at each drawing. He asked questions about each one. He was not performing interest. He was genuinely attending to the information she was conveying about each horse's character and specific attributes. Maya had a horse named Bramble, who was brown and fast. A horse named Cloud, who was white and preferred the rain. A horse named Chester, who was old and gentle and ate apples. He learned these things. He asked whether Chester was named for a place or a person, and Maya considered this question with the gravity it apparently deserved, and said she wasn't sure, but probably a place. Petra made breakfast while this tutorial was ongoing. Callum arrived in the living room in pajamas with a robot on them, sat down beside Ethan, and immediately began providing what he clearly considered necessary context about Maya's horse opinions. "She doesn't actually know any horses," Callum said at volume. "I know about horses," Maya said. "From books," Callum said. "Books are how you learn." Ethan looked at Callum. "She's right." Callum considered this. "Do you know any horses?" "No," Ethan said. "She's still teaching you." "She is," Ethan agreed. Callum nodded, apparently satisfied by this, and went to the kitchen for breakfast. They ate together at Petra's table, Petra and her husband James, and the 2 children, and Ethan. And the morning was ordinary in the specific way that only genuinely good ordinary mornings were, where nobody needed anything from anyone, and the conversation moved through its subjects without agenda, and the food was good, and the light through the kitchen window was doing something uncomplicated with the morning. Petra caught his eye at one point across the table. She had the look that sisters had, the look that contained many years and did not require language. He gave her a small nod, which meant what it meant. She nodded back, which meant something else, something warmer. After breakfast, the children went to the garden. Ethan helped James with the washing up, because James had always done the washing up, and had never, in 4 years of Ethan coming to this house, complained about it. But it was a small, concrete thing that Ethan could do. Petra appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Walk?" They walked around the block, the way they had been walking around this block since Petra had lived here, which was 6 years. The street was wide and tree-lined, and the trees were at the point in spring where the leaves were still new enough to be vivid, but established enough to make proper shade. He told her, in the compressed, efficient way of people who have known each other long enough to skip the scaffolding, what had happened that week. The guilty plea, the judgment, the dissolution order he'd signed Tuesday morning, the Voss Capital call. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "And you're okay," she said. "You asked me that already." "I'm asking again." He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things that actually mattered. "Yes," he said. "I think I have been for a while, actually. Since around the time I submitted the forensic report to Kellner, when the mechanism was complete." He paused. "Everything after that has been watching what I already knew would happen." "That's a strange way to live," she said. "It was," he agreed. "It was also the only way I knew how to survive it." She walked beside him. The trees made their light, regular shade on the pavement. "What about the other stuff?" she said. "Not the legal stuff. Lydia. The years of it." He considered this. The early years. The green-spined novel. The coast. The dock. The beer in cans. "There was something real," he said, "at the beginning. I don't think it was enough. I think we were both in it for reasons that weren't quite what we told ourselves they were. But there was something real." "That's a sad thing to know." "Yes," he said. "It is. But it's less sad than not knowing it." They reached the corner of the block and turned, beginning the loop back. A dog on a lead was pulling its owner towards something interesting behind a hedge. 2 children on bicycles, neither of them Callum or Maya, went by at the particular speed of children who are going fast but haven't yet understood that fast and control are different propositions. "The harbor project sounds interesting," Petra said. "It is. There's a structural complexity to it that I haven't worked on in this specific form before. The mixed commercial and residential zoning creates some financing architecture questions that require a different approach than pure commercial. I've been reading into the Municipal Development Code." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that meant something was genuinely funny. "You find comfort in municipal development codes." "I find clarity in them," he said, "which is close." "That is such an Ethan Carr thing to say." He allowed this. It was, in fact, an Ethan Carr thing to say. They came back around to her front gate. In the garden beyond the gate, Maya was explaining something to a garden ornament with the same focused authority she had deployed on the horse drawings. Callum was doing something structural with sticks that had the ambition of engineering. "Come next Sunday too," Petra said. "If you want." "I'll come next Sunday," he said. He drove back in the late morning. The city was awake by now, doing its Sunday things. The markets, the parks, the particular leisure of a day with no mandatory schedule. He stopped at the coffee shop with the mismatched chairs and the lemon-cleaned floors. He ordered the same flat white. He sat at the same table near the window. He opened the notebook. He wrote, in a clean section, a heading that said simply, "Harbor District, Phase 1. And then he began to work through the structural questions he'd identified from the morning's radio program, mapping them against what he knew of the existing property titles and the municipal zoning overlays, thinking through the acquisition sequence and the financing timeline, and the co-venture parameters he was willing to entertain from Voss Capital, which he had not, in the 48 hours since Claire Nguyen's call, had sufficient information to fully evaluate, but which he intended to approach with the same systematic due diligence he applied to everything. He worked for 2 hours. The coffee went from hot to warm to the temperature of a room. He did not mind. Outside the window, the city continued its Sunday. People moved through it with the specific quality of weekend movement, less directed, more ambient, the way people walked when they had nowhere they strictly had to be. He watched it without watching it, the way you could keep peripheral awareness of a thing while your primary attention was elsewhere. He thought once about the storm, about the smell of petrichor coming off the road, about the cheap coffee at the rest stop, the specific grayness of the cup, about the covered drive at the Alderton Grand with the rain loud at its edges and the valet standing 3 meters away pretending not to watch, about his own face in that moment. He could reconstruct it from the outside because he had lived a version of it before and had seen, in that first version, the exact quality of the breaking. He had worn the face of a man whose model of his own life was failing in real time. This time he had worn a different face, a face that already knew, a face that had already done what needed to be done, a face that, standing at the base of those steps, had been the face of a man watching the final move of a sequence he had already designed execute itself. He did not feel superior about this. He did not feel cold about it either. He simply felt accurate. He had responded to his circumstances with accuracy. He had used what he knew, what he had learned in the specific school of dying and returning, to protect himself with precision instead of breaking apart with raw feeling. He had not suppressed the feeling. He had been sad about the green-spined novel and the cans of beer on the dock. He had been sad about Daniel, in the specific way you could be sad about someone who had been genuinely good for many years before becoming something else. He had let those feelings occupy their appropriate volume, not denied them, not weaponized them, not allowed them to expand into the space that the mechanism needed to run in. That was the balance. That was the thing he had learned, and could not have learned any other way. He looked down at the notebook. The graph paper was covered in neat, organized annotation. The Harbor District project, Phase 1, was taking shape in the clean lines of someone who had learned to think in structures and found the thinking, in itself, satisfying. He picked up the mechanical pencil. He wrote at the bottom of the page, Thursday, Voss Capital, 2 p.m., and circled it. He put the pencil down. Outside, the city kept moving. A woman walked by with a jacket the color of dark copper, and he noticed it for approximately 1 second, and then she was gone around the corner, and his attention returned to the graph paper and the question of zoning overlays and the orderly, forward-facing work of what came next. He did not look for her. He had already seen what he needed to see. Thursday came with a low sky and the smell of rain that didn't fall. He wore a gray suit, no tie, the kind of deliberately understated choice that communicated to people who read clothing carefully that the wearer had no need to be impressive through performance. He arrived at the Voss Capital offices 7 minutes before 2, which was his standard margin. Not early enough to signal eagerness, not on time enough to signal indifference to courtesy. The offices were on the 9th floor of a building that had been renovated well, not aggressively modern, not preserved to the point of pretension, but genuinely considered. Good proportions, natural light, the kind of furnishing that arrived at quality without announcing it. He noticed these things the way he noticed all environments, quickly and without much editorializing. They told him things about institutional character, which told him things about how the people inside them thought about permanence and presentation. Claire Nguyen was 40, or close to it, precise in the way of people who had risen in a field where precision was currency, with sharp attention and a handshake that was neither performed nor perfunctory. She had a second person in the room, a man named Reston, early 50s, whose role she identified as head of our commercial structuring practice, which told Ethan that Voss Capital had sent their technical depth, not their diplomatic surface. This was a working meeting, not a feeling-out session. He respected the directness of that. The term sheet she'd prepared was clean. It proposed a co-acquisition structure in which Voss Capital would fund 60% of the acquisition cost in exchange for an equivalent equity position in the holding structure, with Ethan holding the remaining 40% in his own capacity and taking primary operational control over the asset management function. The development upside would be distributed proportionally after a preferred return hurdle of 8% to Voss Capital's tranche, which was reasonable given their capital position. The zoning question, Ethan said after he'd read through it. He had the Municipal Development Code summary in his notebook, the relevant sections marked. He opened to the right page. The residential overlay on the eastern block creates a density restriction that your Phase 2 development model assumes around rather than through. I think the assumption is wrong. Reston looked up from his own copy of the term sheet. He was the kind of man who became more attentive rather than defensive when challenged on technical points, which was the mark of someone who genuinely trusted his own competence. Walk me through that. Ethan walked him through it. The overlay restriction applied to structures exceeding a certain footprint that included residential units, but contained a specific carve-out under the Municipal Code's Mixed-Use Development Protocol, a protocol that had been amended 3 years ago to encourage commercial residential hybrid structures in harbor-adjacent precincts. If the Eastern Block's residential component was structured under the MUDP classification rather than the standard residential category, the density restriction fell away. This was not a loophole, it was the intended mechanism. The City Planning Department had put the MUDP specifically to invite exactly this kind of development. Most firms hadn't read the 3-year-old amendment carefully. Reston was quiet for approximately 5 seconds. "You found that in the code," he said. "I read the code," Ethan said. Reston looked at Claire. Something passed between them. Not quite a look, more the corporate equivalent of a nod, quick and invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. "That changes the Phase 2 yield calculation significantly. If we can develop the Eastern Block at the unrestricted density..." "Your 8% preferred return becomes conservative," Ethan said. "The corrected model projects 11 to 13, depending on the construction timeline." Another beat of silence. "Mr. Carr," Claire said, "I want to be direct about something." "Please." "We brought this co-venture to you specifically because Kellner's office indicated you had a particular quality. Not just the technical skill, which the public record of your work at Carr Meridian is clear about, but a quality of patience, of not moving until the move was right." She put her pen down. "The Carr Meridian situation over the past 8 months has been watched very carefully in our industry, not just for what happened to Hale, for how it happened. For the fact that someone with your level of foreknowledge, and several people in the legal community have told us informally that the forensic documentation you'd prepared was extraordinarily thorough, chose the regulatory path rather than any other path." Ethan waited. "That's the kind of institutional discipline," Reston added, "that we want on the operational side of a long-duration asset. Not someone who responds to pressure with heat, someone who responds to pressure with structure." Ethan looked at them both. He thought about the accuracy he had been trying to describe to Petra on the Sunday walk, the balance between feeling and function. "The regulatory path was the right path," he said, "not because it was the most satisfying or the most visible, because it was the most durable. Whatever the outcome of the Hale proceedings, they cannot be challenged as personal, as targeted, as anything other than what they were, a properly documented financial oversight action. The outcome holds. If I had done anything else, the outcome would have been contestable." He paused. "The same logic applies to everything I build. I want things that hold." Claire Nguyen looked at him for a moment, with the evaluating attention of someone who has heard many people describe their professional philosophy and is running a specific test against this one. 40% with operational control, she said. And you'll revise the Phase 2 model based on the MUDP analysis. I'll have the revised model to Reston by Monday. Then I think we have the basis of something, she said. And she extended her hand. He shook it. The weeks that followed had the quality of forward motion in a good direction, which was a feeling he had not had in the first life and had worked toward carefully in the second. It was not dramatic. Drama, he had learned, was largely the product of insufficient preparation. The moments where the unprepared person arrived at a situation without adequate structural support and had to respond in real time, under pressure, without the benefit of having already decided. When you had already decided, when the structure was already built, the moments that would have been dramatic for someone else were simply the execution of a plan. The Harbor District acquisition closed on a Thursday in early autumn, 2 days after the season changed, and 6 months after Daniel Hale's guilty plea. Ethan stood in the solicitor's office and signed the transfer documents with the same economy of attention he had brought to signing the dissolution order. A signature on a page in a filing in a structure that was his and that would, if he managed it as he intended, be standing and productive long after the specifics of any particular Thursday were forgotten. He walked out of the solicitor's office into a day that had the cool, particular quality of early autumn. Not cold, just no longer warm. The temperature at which the year began its gradual turning inward. He stood on the pavement and breathed the air, which tasted of the season change, which always tasted the way something shifting from one state to another tasted. Not quite what it had been, not quite what it would become. He thought about the fact that this was, by any reasonable measure, the beginning. Not in the romantic sense of a new chapter. He had no appetite for that framing. In the architectural sense. He had spent 3 years clearing the ground, which was not a glamorous activity. He had removed the structures that would have collapsed on him. He had protected the resources that needed protecting. He had documented and disclosed and filed and waited. And when the mechanism had run, he had stood at a remove from it and let it be what it was. Now the ground was clear. He had his notebook. He had 40% of a Harbor District portfolio under a co-venture with an institutional partner who understood what they were working with. He had a nephew who was swimming better every week and a niece who would, in the fullness of time, probably ride an actual horse and be entirely unsurprised by this development because she had already fully understood horses in theory. He had a hotel room that was no longer temporary because he had signed a year's lease on an apartment 2 floors below his current room. Same building, different orientation, looking not at the harbor but at the city, which offered, in his estimation, a more complete view of the thing he was operating inside. He had, somewhere in the 3-year process of methodical self-reconstruction, become someone he recognized without discomfort. Someone who drove at the right speed for the weather. Who drank the coffee available, whether styrofoam or ceramic. Who signed his name in the appropriate box and did not require the signing to mean more than it meant. His phone showed a message from Petra. The swimming lesson video she'd promised. Callum, executing a passable freestyle stroke, grimacing with the focus of a 6-year-old who intends to be good at the thing. He watched it twice. He sent back a brief reply that contained the word impressive, which was accurate, and a time confirmation for the following Sunday, which was information. He put the phone away. He started walking toward the Harbor District, because the building was his now, or 40% of it was, and he had measurements to take on the eastern block and a structural engineer meeting at 4 o'clock, and the afternoon was doing something agreeable with the available light, and there was work to do. He walked at his own pace. The city moved around him with its own indifferent speed. He didn't look for anything in it. He didn't expect the street to produce confirmation or revelation or any of the things that people looked for in the world around them when they hadn't yet settled into themselves. He had settled, and there was, in the late afternoon of an early autumn day, in a harbor district that was already beginning to look different to him than it had 6 months ago, not because the buildings had changed, but because the buildings were now his buildings to think about and manage and build something from. A quality of presence that he would not have been able to name in the first life. It was the presence of a man who was exactly where he had decided to be, doing exactly what he had prepared to do, carrying nothing he hadn't chosen to carry. The engineering firm's representative was waiting at the Eastern Bloc entrance when he arrived, a young woman with a hard hat and a tablet, and the expression of someone for whom precision was a comfort, which told him immediately that they were going to understand each other. He held out his hand. "Ethan Carr," he said. "Miss Park," she said. "Ready when you are." "Let's start with the load-bearing assessment on the south wall," he said. "I want to understand the structural limits before we talk about the residential overlay." She nodded, already pulling up the documentation on her tablet. He followed her through the entrance into the cool interior of the building, which smelled of concrete and the specific, honest smell of a space that was waiting to be decided about. And he took out his notebook, and he began.